Welcome to r/Prorevenge, where OP destroys the life of a child abuser. A bit of context first. I'm an only child born in the USA to older parents. They were both 45 when I was born, who immigrated from Venezuela in the 90s. When I was 2, my dad was shot in the head. He lived for another 13 years, but the incident permanently damaged parts of his brain, and he was a completely different person for those last 13 years. He went from being the most loving, incredible, caring, compassionate person around to an aggressive, violent butthole who blew up over the smallest things, but only ever at his inner circle. Me, my mother, and other close family. He always managed to keep his composure around strangers for fear of someone calling the police and getting him arrested, but he would later let it all out on my mom and myself, admittedly mostly me. After the shooting, he could never work again, and my mom was forced into the position of being the family's sole breadwinner. We lived in poverty for many years because the USA wouldn't recognize her college degree and she couldn't afford to go to college again. So she couldn't work in her field and had to start at the bottom of the ladder. Dad eventually died when I was 15 of issues related to his shooting. Now, when I was 7, my parents decided to move into a town with a better reputation for their schools than the one we were currently living in, so that I could attend a better school. They bought a house literally on the edge of town. Most of this town is incredibly expensive, but because on the other side of the street and across the town line, there's a big complex of government subsidized housing, our area is much cheaper. This is the house with the butthole neighbor. The house is a 3-family. For the last 16 years, we have owned and occupied the first floor, while the terrible neighbor lived on the second floor until recently. The third floor has been occupied by over 10 owners and tenants over these years. None have stayed more than 3 or 4 years, and some have stayed as little as a handful of months. Now, the second floor jerk, let's call her Karen, because obviously. She has a husband who we'll call Bill, and they have a young son, Henry. Here's the story. When we moved in, Karen and Bill had already been there for a few short months. The 3 of us on the first floor, Karen and Bill on the second, and the original third floor owners, bought the house from the same crew who had bought it and turned it into a 3-family, fixing it up in the process. Karen quickly showed her true colors as a bully. Over the years, there's been countless examples of nasty stuff she's pulled. Her husband, Bill, is an immigrant himself and doesn't speak very good English. He's very submissive to her and does whatever she wants, but in front of other people makes himself out to be physically dominant. In our first years here, they used to fight a lot, which we regularly heard from downstairs. They would yell, sometimes for hours, and occasionally it seemed like things got violent. Henry was born maybe 10 years ago. He doesn't factor into the story until much later. But anyways, the point is, whatever Karen's done, she's always gotten away with it. Here are a couple highlights. My mom always took pride in how well she took care of our trash bin and recycling bin. Every month, she'd give them a quick rinse after that week's trash day just to make sure they wouldn't develop a smell or a colony of bacteria wouldn't move in. Karen apparently wasn't so diligent, and one time her recycling bin got really nasty. And I mean really nasty. So she just left it out back. Context, behind the house isn't a backyard, it's just pavement with a parking spot designated for each unit, and began using ours. Lo and behold, ours started to get nasty, and Mom quickly went from spending a quick 3 minutes rinsing it out every month to about 45 minutes scrubbing with soap and water to clean it out. Eventually, we decided we'd had enough, and she and Dad sent Karen and the third floor tenants of the time a polite but firm email that basically said, "Whoever started using our recycling bin, please stop and use your own. You never asked our permission and we take good care of it. And ever since you began using it, it's become disgusting." We knew it was Karen and Bill, but Mom and Dad figured it was more polite without a call out, and they didn't want to start anything. Within a week, 2 things happened. Karen and Bill got a brand spanking new recycling bin, and one week we found ours had been mysteriously destroyed. Someone took a knife to it and cut it to pieces. We had no way of knowing who it was, but we had a pretty good feeling we knew exactly who it was. Yes, we had to get a new one. Because we had no evidence of who did it though, my parents didn't say anything about it. Back when we could afford a car, we haven't had one since our first few years here, we used our parking space out back. Every time that Karen and Bill hosted a party, which back then was surprisingly frequently, they would toss their trash over the balcony into the general vicinity of the trash and recycling bins out back, which is literally right next to our designated parking space. Most of the dents we had in our old '88 Toyota were from bottles thrown from the second floor balcony. We had windows break a couple times, same deal. Each time it happened, my parents would politely go upstairs, knock on Karen and Bill's door, and respectfully ask them to stop throwing stuff over the balcony, because we know you don't mean it, but sometimes it accidentally hits our car. Each time they went and did that, Karen and Bill stopped, but they would do it again until they got caught during their next party. Again though, my parents never wanted to escalate the situation, so they never justified taking it further than knocking on our door and politely asking them to stop. This is another example of Karen's utter garbage behavior, but it's also relevant for the revenge part of the story, so I'm putting it after the bullet point section. Our basement is shared between all 3 units. Each unit has its designated space boxed out, kind of like office cubicles, and there's some designated common area in between. Years ago, maybe like 8 or 9, Karen and Bill completely filled their designated basement cubicle, so they just started piling junk all over the common area. Eventually, they developed this enormous pile of junk in front of our unit's oil tank for heating. My mom and dad never said anything because it happened over a long period of time and they didn't want to start a fight. And as far as I know, none of the 3rd floor folks ever said anything either, but it got to the point where she and her husband were taking up common area space that was easily twice the size of their designated cubicle. Now, I'll be the first to admit that for many years, my parents and I weren't great neighbors either. We didn't bully anyone, but due to my dad's condition, he could be triggered by seemingly anything, and suddenly he'd be in a rage and we'd all be yelling. I grew up in that generally chaotic environment, and yeah, there were several times when the police were called to our house for noise disturbances. But we kept our stuff to ourselves, and we were nothing but polite and respectful to all our neighbors, always. That said, you can imagine that our first priority was always my dad and his stability, and we had enough on our hands with that. So he and mom always swallowed their pride and avoided doing anything to antagonize Karen, no matter how terrible her behavior got. And believe you me, there are plenty more stories on top of the ones I told above. After my dad died, I developed my own issues for a while with mental health. Growing up in a constantly chaotic, violent, aggressive environment took its toll on me. And for a time, I had deeply depressive tendencies. I struggled with suicidality for years and eventually wound up graduating high school after 8 years of attending classes in some form or another. Similar to when my dad was sick, I became my mother's top priority at that point. So again, Karen and Bill kept getting away with all her BS. I got better though. Nowadays, I'm even off my psychiatric medication. I got my stuff together and graduated high school and even college. I have my bachelor's and I'm doing some post-grad stuff for a master's. Most of the way has been paid for by scholarships, but I recently decided that as an adult now, and therefore as someone with a little more say in things around the house than when I was a kid, I had had enough of watching Karen bully my parents, particularly my mother, for so many years. I wanted revenge. Phase 1 of my plan was to ease my way into the adult condo administration dialogue. I began helping out more around the house, as in around the common area parts. I single-handedly redid the back porch's flooring. It sounds like more than it is. I just pulled out all the floorboards and nailed new ones in. I replaced both storm doors about 6 months apart when each one began having problems. Different kinds of problems, it doesn't matter what they were. I also took care of some comparatively smaller things. I weed whacked out back for a couple hours, cut the grass out front a few times, and got up early so that I could beat everyone else to the shoveling every time it snowed one winter. I also began wheeling back everyone's recycling and trash bins after trash every week, not just our own. After the first 2 bullet point stuff, each time I sent out an email to everyone in the condo to let them know what I had taken care of, and that all I asked of the other 2 units was for them to reimburse me 1/3 of the cost of the materials on their timetable, because of course I hadn't given them a heads up, so it was only fair that I allow them to pay me when they can. The smaller stuff from the last bullet point I obviously didn't need to announce. The idea was just that over time, the neighbors would see me taking more initiative in things and being more active, which would go on to justify me participating more in intercondo politics. I also made a point to keep conversations to email so that there would be a written record of every interaction. Phase 2 of my plan ran pretty much concurrently to Phase 1, but had an entirely different purpose and was overall entirely different. I began gathering evidence of everything I could. I asked my mom to track down all the old emails she and dad had exchanged with the neighbors, documenting many instances that Karen and Bill had pulled stuff. I went downstairs and took a video of Karen and Bill's stuff all over the common area, particularly emphasizing all the highly flammable wooden and cardboard stuff they had piled up in front of our oil tank. I dug up and poured over the deed to our apartment, specifically the sections that detailed the rules around common areas and the limitations of our unit as compared to the others and vice versa. To my utter joy, Mom and Dad never threw out that old recycling bin that Karen and or Bill had knifed up, apparently because they just never knew what to do with it and never wanted anyone to ask questions. Naturally, I dug it up and took plenty of photos. I did one other evidence gathering thing that needs a bit more explanation. Karen and Bill are awful parents. Mom and I regularly hear the stuff they do to Henry through the very thin ceiling we have here. I'm decidedly not going to go into detail because even though I changed his name, he's still underage, and I feel it would be disrespectful to him to do that. But let's say it crosses far into the realm of child abuse. This is a topic I'm particularly sensitive about because I grew up in a sucky situation myself, so believe me when I say this part is the most satisfying part of my revenge. Let's just say that every time I could hear stuff through the ceiling, I took out my phone and started a recording until it stopped. Finally, phase 3 of my plan was basically to bait Karen and or Bill into a trap I set that, as it turns out, would have humongous consequences for them. Mom and I had this old treadmill that we got for free. It's in the kitchen, and lately we've come to the conclusion that it just takes up a little too much space. We both use it a little, but not enough to justify keeping it. She wanted to toss it out, but I argued hard to keep it around because I knew I could use it for this plan. It would be my only shot. Remember how I mentioned we haven't had a car for years? Well, eventually I convinced Mom to let me put the treadmill outside in our parking space out back. I bought a large tarp to cover it with so it would be protected from the rain, and I told her I'd start using it more if it was outside because it's nicer to do exercise in the fresh air. I also sent out an email to Karen, CC'd to Bill and the current third floor folks, asking her to move all the things in front of our oil tank in the basement somewhere else. Despite the fact that those things had been there for many years, I justified addressing it now because I'm the one addressing it. And that's different from before because before I was a child and now I'm an adult who actively participates in the intercondo dialogue. I asked her to because the way she currently had it set up is a safety hazard and I'm just following the rules. I further let her know that if she and Bill didn't take care of it within a handful of weeks, that I would have no choice but to take care of it myself. In the same email, I let everyone know that I was putting our treadmill in our parking space out back, so that if anyone had any trouble with getting into their parking spot to please let me know. The same day I sent out the email, I put the treadmill out back. Now, I figured nothing was going to change from all the other emails I had sent out about matters regarding the condo's administration, and nothing did. She and Bill never acknowledged anything. The current third floor guy didn't want anything to do with going up against Karen, so he just thanked me for the heads up about the treadmill and said nothing else. It's also important to note here that my real reason for mentioning the treadmill in that email wasn't in case anyone has any trouble getting into their parking spot. Needless to say, sure, a treadmill in a kitchen is pretty freaking big and obnoxious, but a treadmill off to the side of an automobile parking space isn't really big at all. Plus, I placed it in such a way that it wasn't in anyone's way, giving everyone ample room to maneuver around. It was just there, off to the side. The reason I mentioned the treadmill in that email was to alert her to its presence, and perhaps associate it in her mind with my request for her to move all her junk in the basement. I also began using it at least 3 mornings a week. I timed it so that sometimes Karen and Bill would run into me as they left to drive Henry to school. Every time I saw them, I waved and greeted to ensure they'd notice me on the treadmill. Mom also used it a few times, but she wasn't part of my plan, so I have no idea if she ever ran into them while on it. Here's the other thing I did. I set up a video camera in our laundry basket. See, we have it permanently in the pantry, next to the pantry window that faces the back area. I buried it beneath clothing so that from outside you can't even see it, but I bought a few massive, memory storage wise, not physically, SD cards and kept the thing recording 24/7 with a timestamp. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The camera recorded nothing suspicious and Karen and Bill didn't move their stuff in the basement. Their time was up, so one night I got up at around 1 a.m. when everyone else was asleep so nobody would hear me and went downstairs to move their junk. Reddit, I can't express to you how much I enjoyed this. I bought a GoPro, put it on my noggin, and carefully recorded the entire hour and a half of moving stuff around. I took the enormous pile of junk in front of Mom and I's oil tank and found a way to fit all of it into their designated storage cubicle. In the end, it was packed. I have mild OCD and I nearly had an orgasm at the end from how well organized physically everything was, so that everything was neatly packed together and all the space was used at maximum efficiency. It was glorious, packed from floor to ceiling and almost wall to wall all around. If you can imagine one massive, near perfect rectangular prism of junk, that's what I had created. It was a masterpiece. I was so proud. On the side the door was on, there was enough space to walk to either wall, but you couldn't move into it anywhere. I got back upstairs to our apartment and couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I was beyond excited. I wound up watching Infinity War to prepare for Ant-Man and the Wasp's then upcoming release. Sure enough, Karen and Bill took the bait. I must have been at school or work when they first discovered the basement because I never heard a thing about it. In hindsight, it's probably best I was out, even though I would have savored those angry shrieks like nothing ever before. In any case, within a few days, we discovered our treadmill destroyed. Similar to the recycling bin of years past, it had been knifed up. I can imagine they probably wanted to straight up take a hammer to it, but they didn't want to make too much noise, so they wound up just tearing the thing apart with a really big and really sharp knife. They had seen that we were using it, and aside from our trash and recycling bins, it was our only property that they had access to at that point. Several years back, I filled up the rest of the wall of our basement cubicle and installed a door with a lock, so our cubicle is now sealed off to everyone else, but the others are open and anyone can enter. Plus, I can imagine destroying a $1,000 treadmill is infinitely more tempting than a trash or recycling bin. So they went for it in retaliation for my stunt in the basement. After moving their junk in the basement, I started timing my treadmill use differently so that I wouldn't run into them. As soon as I saw it after they destroyed it, I went straight to the camera I had set up in the pantry. It caught the whole thing. In true fashion of their relationship, Bill brandished an enormous knife and single-handedly destroyed the whole thing himself, while she stood next to him and seemingly ordered him to do it. She basically kept pointing around at all the parts she wanted to cut up. With that in hand, I called the police, reported the incident, told them that my mother and I felt threatened by their presence, and we filed a restraining order against both Karen and Bill with the police that same day. I turned over all the evidence I had gathered of all their stuff over the years, and I also turned over all the audio clips I had of Karen and Bill terrorizing Henry. I figured since it was all audio and no video, it wouldn't be enough to get him out of their care, but maybe it'd at least get the Department of Children and Families involved. Karen and Bill immediately claimed that I had broken a bunch of their stuff while moving it around in the basement, stuff that they no doubt had already broken themselves. So I offered my GoPro recordings as proof that I had not, in fact, broken any of their stuff while moving it at all. The restraining order a person is allowed to file with a police report is always temporary, but you can always petition the court to extend it. Once Mom and I did that, it was granted. At that point, Karen and Bill hadn't been legally allowed to go back home for a week, and since it became a longer-term restraining order, they were basically not going to be allowed to live in their own home for several years. So they made the obvious choice to sell the house and move elsewhere. Needless to say, selling a house you're not allowed to be near is a difficult task, and moving all your stuff out of said house is even more difficult, particularly when you have so much of it. They wound up coordinating the entire house's sale from afar, with the realtor being the only person who came around to show the house. Once it was time for them to move, some relatives of theirs came around and packed everything up and loaded it into a truck. Also, I was right. Based on my recordings alone, Henry wasn't taken from their custody. But DCF did get involved. I heard from their family that came around to pack up their stuff, though, that Karen and Bill did wind up losing custody of him. They didn't say much as to why, but they basically implied that the abuse ramped up a lot after everything that went down between me and Karen and Bill, which is the only part I feel guilty about, but in the end, I hope this is a situation where the end justifies the means. At which point, DCF was already sniffing around, so they wound up losing custody of him anyways. I have no idea where Henry wound up, but wherever he is, I obviously have nothing against him, and I hope he winds up in a much better situation than he was. Finally, I will say, for two such inordinately obtuse and disgusting human beings, they had surprisingly decent family members. The few times I ran into them and made small talk when they were around, they were pretty apologetic about the whole thing. I got the impression that this isn't the first time they're apologizing on Karen and Bill's behalf. I hope Henry is taken in by one of them and not chucked into the foster system. Here's hoping, kid. Update. Holy cow, this is great. Karen lost her job. Or at least, she's not working where she had been anymore. I assume she was fired, or at least that it had something to do with what went down, but I don't actually have a way to know. I got curious though after posting this here because I remembered she worked as a guidance counselor at a school a few towns away, and I figured if the school had found out that the DCF took her kid, they might not have wanted her there anymore, and I may have been right. Anyways though, I got curious, so I asked a friend to ring the school secretary and asked to be transferred to the guidance department where they asked for Karen's desk. She, my friend, said the guidance secretary just matter-of-factly said, "I'm sorry, that staff member is no longer employed here." And that was that. I have read hundreds of stories on r/Prorevenge, and my absolute favorite are the ones where OP gets revenge by doing basically nothing. Sometimes when you meet a true human piece of garbage, all you have to do is just give them the rope to hang themselves. OP did nothing wrong. He didn't break the law. In fact, the only thing he did was be a nice neighbor. Like, how much of a piece of trash human do you have to be to get a restraining order placed on you because you were upset that your neighbor was too nice? That was r/Prorevenge, and this video was a little bit different because it was just one really long story, and I'm not sure if I want to do that in the future because I kind of like the diversity of a bunch of different stories, so let me know what you thought of this video. Do you like the really long stories, or should I break it up more?